Hey class, it's Dr. Maxfield DiCarlo. Here's your Friday morning edition of Death, Dying, and Bereavement. Last week we had our theory debate, so we sort of talked about theory and how those kind of help us understand people who are grieving, people who are dying. But this week we're going to kind of touch down on circling back to Worden's tasks of grief and his task theory. But what I wanted to touch base on today are mediators of mourning. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the mediators of mourning, how that impacts the grieving process, how these present risk factors for the grieving process. And then we're going to also talk a little about the different types of complicated grief, because thus far in class, we've kind of been talking about sort of the normative grief process, but certainly people come in and they have complications. And so there's complicated grief, and there's anticipatory grief for people who are in the process of losing someone who is dying. So talk a little bit about that as well. So Worden, and I will post this PowerPoint too, really talks about how there are these sort of 7 factors that really impact whether or not someone's going to move through the normative grief process, or their risk factors for moving into a more complicated grief. The first one is who the person is, who the person that has died is, and so that is really going to have a huge impact on the grieving process. So when we think about that, if we think about in our culture, and we've talked a little bit about this before, is that losing a child is thought to be very abnormal, which has not been the case in history and in other cultures. So for us in Western culture, losing a child would be very abnormal. So that could be a risk factor for complicated grief, because it's so outside of the norm of what we think should. There's that cognitive behavioral word, should, right, that we're always trying to fix with cognitive restructuring, but that we really shouldn't be losing children. As opposed to if a person is, a spouse and they're 90 years old, right? Even though we know a good response is not to say, oh, well, at least you had a long life together, right? There's some potential complication if someone's been married. My grandparents were married for 65 years. Can you imagine? 65 years together, and then one person dies and they're alone. So who the person was is really very, very important in looking at if this could potentially impact in a negative way the grief process. The nature of the attachment, we're going to talk about that again on the next slide. It's also a mediator. The mode, how the person died, is an important factor, and particularly plays into the task of coming to the reality of the loss, and if depending on the mode of death, that can be very challenging for people. Looking at past losses, personal variables, social variables, the support that they have, and concurrent stressors. So I'm going to skip to the next slide where we have this kind of written out a little bit more. So moving to the next piece, the nature of the attachment. When we look at who the person was, that's important to know the relationship that they had with that person. But it's not enough. We also have to look at the nature of the attachment. Was it a strong, secure attachment? If it was, then oftentimes we see that people still are very much grieving the loss, but because they had a secure attachment, they oftentimes are able to move through the grieving process without too many hiccups, if you will, or issues in their grieving sort of trajectory. we kind of look at the strength of that, the security of the attachment. Was it a secure attachment? So, each person was independent and able to support each other, and they had a secure attachment, but they weren't maybe in a meshed relationship. They weren't in a conflictual relationship. Um, uh, this is an interesting one, right? Because, this is the game that we all play when we start thinking about loss. My husband and I have this conversation all the time. We've basically determined that he could die before me, which is good because we know that men usually don't have as long life expectancy. He could die before me, and although that would really stink, and I hate it, and absolutely would not like that and have to go through this process. I probably could function pretty well on my own at some point, right? He, on the other hand, insists that he would not be able to live on. And this is more not necessarily about the security of the relationship, but rather that the roles that he would have to take on would be immense. And so he is uncertain he would be able to do that. So we have to look at the security, the self-esteem of the survivor, their ability to take on other roles and feel comfortable in that. What roles do they currently have? What roles did they have in the past? What roles do they take on? We have folks, I see folks all the time who literally have not paid a bill. They wouldn't know where their mortgage or their rent is supposed to go. They have no idea where their bank accounts are. When my grandfather recently died, his wife had no idea where any of the money was, and he had systematically stashed it in places. Now, again, he was a survivor of World War II, so very much believed in having cash on hand. So it was a scavenger hunt, right, for her to try to find the money that he left because she had no idea. So we look at sort of the roles that people take on. Another really important piece in this nature of the attachment is any ambivalence that there might be in a relationship. We see this a lot of times with kids who maybe have lost a parent, who the parent was maybe abusive or neglectful in some way, and then the parent dies and the child is left sort of being glad that they are moving forward in their life because of the trauma that they experienced at the hand of their parent. But yet on the other hand, sort of have this ambivalence of feeling like I loved them, but yet I hated what they were doing. And so really important in therapy to be able to normalize that. So that clients will know that that ambivalence happens oftentimes in grief. Or just to think that relationships aren't ambivalent might become somewhat naive at times, right? So important to look at the ambivalence in a relationship. I think I mentioned this before, working with a gentleman who had, when his wife was diagnosed, he had been having an affair for about 3 years. And so he ended that relationship to focus on helping his wife through this process, knowing that she had stage 4 cancer, that she was probably going to die, but their focus was keeping her alive for as long as possible and helping her through that dying process. So there was definitely some ambivalence in that relationship because she, the wife, never knew about the affair, but clearly he did, and sort of held some guilt and shame about that. And then as he was engaging in the relationship with his wife, there was some ambivalence there. So all of those things are things that as we're doing our assessment and we're looking at what's going on can really shape whether or not there's a possibility for some complicated grief along the way. Conflicts with the deceased, right? Oftentimes when people have a conflictual relationship with someone, and then particularly if there's a situation where there's an unexpected death and there's a conflict, can be very, very challenging for people to negotiate their grieving process, because the element of I will be able to fix this relationship at some point if I want to goes out the window, and there's no way to resolve those conflicts. So oftentimes we see people coming in for grief therapy who have some unresolved things that they wanted to be able to say, things that they never got to work through, and including in grief therapy then some like parts therapy, right? Where people can go back to previous trauma or conflict and sort of work through at the age that they were that was going on, and work through that process can be very beneficial. Doing some, experiments, if you will, where you can do just some resolution work with people, where they can write letters to the deceased. They can, write about the conflict that they had, so that they can sort of work through those conflicts even when that person's not there any longer. Okay. Oftentimes, if we see folks who have had a very dependent relationship, this can be very challenging for folks. Again, I think this really speaks to the roles that people take on. And so if they are forced into roles that maybe they've never had to do before, and have been in a relationship where they really were very dependent on someone else, then they're not only dealing with the loss of that person, but they're dealing with a pretty steep learning curve on roles and things that maybe they never had any desire to learn. So very challenging for folks. When I think about that, I think about a lady that I worked with that came into my office, and she said, I think I'm ready to try to go on vacation. And so, oh, okay, sounds great. Like, yeah, vacation, that's good. And then she started explaining that her husband had died like 5 or 7 years prior to that. And he had always planned the vacations. He booked the flights, booked the hotel, always did all the planning. So she never had to do any of that. And because she had never had to do that, she had been terrified to attempt to try to do any of that. And so she had not gone on vacation, not done anything sort of pleasurable that would require any planning since he had died. And not because she didn't want to, but that she was terrified to try, because that was not within her skill set of the last 40 years of being with her husband. So something that we worked on, helping her be able to gain confidence in some of those roles. Okay, so that's sort of the nature of the attachment. When you work in end-of-life care, particularly in many hospices, they will actually have a check sheet where you actually like check off where are potential concerns for complicated grief. And so you'll look at each one of these things and evaluate if the person that you're assessing has the potential for those. And if there are a good portion of areas that could be of concern, then usually what happens is that we get them into bereavement services early, so that we can try to get them to access services before they start having some complications. Okay, one of the elements that I think is so important to think about is how the person died. We think about this a lot of times when we're thinking about trauma, right? We're thinking, did the survivor see the person die? Because, right, that's one of the elements of PTSD, is that they may have experienced or seen someone die, or some sort of trauma occur. So did they see it? Usually, if that's the case, that's sort of an instant, let's get them access to services early, because there's a huge incidence of PTSD and complicated grief when someone's seen the person die in a violent way, right? It's an interesting question when we start talking about hospice too, because here we have where people are dying in their homes, so that they can die with dignity and sort of die on their own terms. And sometimes what we have happen is that folks will say, you know, I really want to die at home. Families on board with that. Yes, I want my loved one to be here. And as it gets closer and the person starts what we would deem actively dying, they say, no, 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 I can't do this. And so then we might bring them inpatient, so that they inpatient in a hospice facility, if possible, to let them die there. In talking with people who have experienced a loved one dying in the home that has been on hospice, oftentimes there are some pictures that sort of get embedded in their brain of seeing the hospital bed with their loved one dead, that are challenging for people as well. So even in the process of hospice, which we sort of idealize that it's a good death, and many times is, there's a potential when we start looking at proximity, and were you there with the person when they died, and were you prepared? Maybe that's the missing element here. Were you prepared for that? Because if not, it can be very traumatic. Having conversations with people when they have a loved one who's potentially going to die at home, of what that could look like, so that they're prepared to understand what to expect, what that could look like, how long that could take, can all help on the bereavement side, so that they're prepared for that process. In talking with folks who have experienced death in hospice, and survivors and their loved ones, they'll often say, I was prepared for what to expect when my loved one died, and that process was a beautiful process, because I got to be with them. We got to do exactly the way that my loved one wanted and had said they wanted. The part I wasn't prepared for was when the funeral home came in and took my loved one out of the home. That process of them putting them in a bag and taking them out of the house was traumatic for me, and seeing that process. So another thing for us to be thinking about and asking that question: where were you when the person died? You were with them. Where were you when the funeral home came and took the body? Where were you? So that we can be thinking about the types of pictures and memories that a person may be struggling to sort through as they're dealing with their grief. Okay, so the suddenness of the loss is also something that we want to look at. We know, and this is one of those challenging situations where folks who say that they've experienced a sudden loss, there's been a car accident or something like that, and they've lost a loved one, will often say, I just wish, I look at people who have experienced a terminal illness and had time to talk with their loved one, and had 6 months of treatment and those kinds of things. I wish that I had that time. On the flip side of that, oftentimes we see that people who are in the midst of an illness where they have more time and there's treatment and there's relapse and all of those things, will say, it would have been so much easier if this had just been done in a split second, and then I could have picked myself up and started working through the grieving process. So it's a little bit of the grass is always greener on the other side, but when we look at the research and we see that folks who have experienced a sudden loss oftentimes fare more poorly in their grieving process than folks who have had an extended loss. Now, that's an interesting one too, because I just think we may need more research to look at chronic illness, things like Alzheimer's, because we also know the toll that that plays on caregivers. So, but for what it's worth, one of the mediators of mourning is that we need to look at that. How sudden was this? The trauma we've already kind of talked about. Were there multiple losses? This is a really challenging situation when someone has lost multiple family members. Maybe those family members were all lost at the same time. There was a car accident. Everyone died except for one person or something like that. So that could definitely be the situation. We would also want to look at a history of losses, because as we've talked about, I think in class previously, oftentimes we have folks who have experienced a loss, and then 3 months later they experience another loss, and 2 months later they experience another loss. And so there's not really time in between each of those losses to work through grief. And as we know, once you've experienced a loss, every time you experience another loss, it sort of dredges up all of the past losses that you've had. And if those are in close proximity to each other, there's just not even time to even potentially work through some of that. Preventable deaths is also another mediator that we need to sort of evaluate for. We oftentimes see this with situations where there's been some sort of abuse or neglect. Worked with a lady who was in prison for life because she had killed her children, and actually not even sure that she killed them or not, because of her mental illness. They were unsure. So when we look at that kind of a situation, those are sometimes they're preventable losses. And truly, there are folks who are responsible for a loss. But I think sometimes in the process of that, we forget that they still can grieve just because they are responsible or that they had a part in that process of losing that that child or that person. They're still potentially in the grieving process, so we need to be very careful in making assumptions that they're not grieving, even though they are the perpetrator in the situation. Okay, ambiguous death. This is one of those situations where we have to look at sometimes we see this with the military where the body is never found, and the person is presumed dead, or cases where someone was kidnapped, and we don't know, we're thinking that that's the case. We see these cases, they get a lot of the news, publicity, that kind of thing, but cases that are sort of unresolved. So families are left with the idea that, like, I need to grieve this loss because this person is never coming back. But then there's still that window of possibility that maybe they will come back. Maybe they're living somewhere, they have no idea who they are, and eventually they'll come back walking through the door. So we see that a lot. Sometimes we see that with coupled with proximity as well. When someone goes on a business trip and gets in a car accident and dies, there's just this element of fantasy that oftentimes happens with people who are grieving, where they really know that I didn't get to see the body, so it's possible that they had the wrong person. My loved one's still on a business trip, or I've heard of cases where the loved one believes that they must have been on a business trip and we were fighting and we wanted to get divorced, so he just left me or she just left me, and they're still alive somewhere. And so there's just this ambivalence of, are they alive? Is it possible they could come back at some point? And then we look at stigmatized death. We're going to be talking lots more about this, particularly in relation to suicide and homicide. But oftentimes there are these deaths like suicide that are so stigmatized that we, and not us in this watching this video, hopefully, but as a society, we say, though, there must have been something so wrong with this family unit, and we sort of blame for the loss and for the death. And so in some ways, we take away the person's right to grief. They then experience disenfranchised grief, where they just society doesn't see that they have a right to grieve. This is a really interesting one when we start talking about controversial topics such as abortion, and is that oftentimes, and this is a challenging one because there's much research out there to show that after an abortion, a woman and the father may very much grieve the loss of that child. But society says, well, you chose to have an abortion. Why in the world would you be grieving, right? So we make these assumptions that that person can't grieve because they made a choice about that situation. On the other hand, there are situations too where people have an abortion and to assume that they should be grieving in some way is very violating as well, because they're not, and that is they're not grieving, and so to assume that they should be in some way oftentimes is really a violation and distressing as well. So we have to be really careful with these kind of stigmatized deaths, that we assess where the person is at and how they are reacting to the loss, so that we don't make any assumptions about how they should or should not be grieving and how they kind of fit into that process. Okay, so those are the kind of the broad scope mediators of mourning. I do want to go back because we talked about how the person died. We didn't, history of past losses. The thing that's interesting about this one, and I know I say it all the time, is that loss simply just doesn't happen in a vacuum. So to think that someone has lost a loved one and there's no other losses, maybe not death related, that are going on in their life is just simply incorrect. So we need to be very careful about that. For example, when my grandfather died, he had gotten remarried at like 90, which is adorable. But his wife, they were married for about 3-4 years. She had my grandmother's ashes because they were in their house, and that house now belongs to her. And so pretty much everything in it is also hers. And so my mother then was grieving the loss of her dad, but also grieving the loss of not being able to have the ashes because they're in this other woman's possession, and until things all sort of settle out and she decides to move out, then that's where it's going to be. And so a secondary loss of not having those ashes. Other losses are oftentimes folks will be faced with having to move out of their home after experiencing a loss if they can't stay there. Sometimes they have loss of relationships. If we see this sometimes with couples, that one spouse or partner dies, and they sort of had really rested on that partner's friends. So that was their social network, and all of a sudden that social network sort of evaporates, and the person is left with not having that strong support. So important to look at multiple different types of losses. We'll talk when we talk about hospice as well, but sometimes when someone dies in the hospital and they've had a chronic illness, we see that there's a history of strong support from the medical team. And so a secondary loss after the person dies is that they're not on the unit. They're not seeing those nurses, those doctors, their social worker anymore, because that relationship has ended. And so it's another loss that people can experience. Personal variables, we're really kind of talking about people's resilience, the coping skills that they have, their social variables, so the supports that they have, maybe their financial supports that they have. Certainly, all of these things play into whether or not they're having some certain secondary losses, and also the supports that they have in place and the resources they have in place to manage the stress and the grief they're going through. Okay, let me move over here. We think about grief in a couple different ways. We sort of categorize these into broad categories. And we think about normative grief, which again is something that we've kind of gotten to the point where we're questioning what that looks like with the DSM-5 and this idea of a diagnosis of persistent grief reactions. That's not a diagnosis at this point, but is being researched for future editions of the DSM. So what does normative grief look like? And that gets challenging. But outside of sort of this normative grief, we also have abnormal, or what we would deem as complicated grief. So we're going to talk just a little bit about what each one of these things looks like. Another piece of this, just so that you can keep this in mind, is that oftentimes we have anticipatory grief. And this is sort of reserved when someone is a caregiver, when someone is their loved one is diagnosed with an illness, and they start to anticipate realizing that this person is going to die. And so oftentimes we see that people start working through the grieving process before their loved one actually dies. And that can be helpful. It can be challenging. There's lots of research going on about how that looks when we start looking at things like chronic illness that could be very long illnesses with Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that, where the person could be a caregiver for 10, 12 years. So they are working through that grieving process of losing the essence of who someone is in this process of their illness. So oftentimes they've done a lot of grief work before the person even dies. Okay, so let's look at normal grief right here. Not that we haven't talked about this before. The thing that's important to remember about sort of a normative grief reaction is that we're talking about not just the way people are feeling, the way they're thinking, right? The way they're behaving oftentimes, and we're going to see that much more when we start talking about instrumental versus intuitive grievers, when we start talking about gender differences and grieving styles, but sometimes we see behavioral manifestations of grief. But I do want to highlight here too is that oftentimes we see physical manifestations of grief. So people will have physical pain in response to their emotional reaction to the grieving process. So it's very important. We're going to talk more about it, but I think just keeping in mind that the neuropathways for which our brain interprets pain are the same when we are in physical pain as they are when we are in emotional distress. So oftentimes when we're in emotional distress, our body will interpret that as physical pain, and we will feel fatigued and we will feel pain. And that's very important to remember, because oftentimes people come in and say, I'm fine, but I'm having all these physical symptoms, and that can very much be indicative of an emotional response that's sort of converted into a physical response to a grief reaction. Okay, abnormal complicated grief. How do we know if someone is having some sort of complicated grief reaction? Well, okay, this is what I would say, is that when we look at that, we see that oftentimes people have a lot of difficulty discussing the loss. So important piece of this is that if you're talking to somebody and they lost somebody a week ago or a month ago or 2 months ago, and they're having a hard time discussing that loss, pretty normal, right? What we're talking about is this a delayed grief response where you're talking to somebody 7 years from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now. I've talked with people that 20 years ago they had a loss and they can't talk about that loss without having an intense emotional reaction, not just having sort of some tears and being sad. They have an intense emotional reaction to a loss that they're discussing that was years and years and years ago. Okay, so also sometimes we see with complicated grief, minor events will trigger an intense reaction, physical or grief reaction. So there's a dissonance and a disconnect between the trigger and the emotional response that we are seeing. Sometimes we see themes coming up in complicated grief. Where there'd be a theme. We see this with kids sometimes, is that I've worked with kids who, a kid that their father died of stomach cancer, and it was very rapid. He went to the ER, very healthy in the military, goes to the ER with stomach pain, thinking he's got some kind of like stomach flu, diagnosed with stomach cancer, and died within like a month and a half. So now this child is afraid to eat because she has stomach pain all the time. She comes home from school often because she's saying that her stomach is hurting. So there's like these psychosomatic themed, like everything is about her stomach that we're seeing coming up. Physical symptoms, again, a little bit of that is normative, like we just talked about with pain, but we have to be really careful of that too, because if people are starting to have so many physical symptoms that it's impacting their ability to function, again, we're talking about functionality here, then we need to take note of that there could be some complicated grief reaction going on. Self-destructive behavior, right? None of us have ever seen that before, right? We see people who become increasingly risk-taking in their behavior. Sometimes we'll see folks who, in response to their grief, will, just start doing very high-risk sports. They're skydiving, they're rock climbing. Now, if all of those things were happening before the loss, then okay, that's fine. But we're looking for rapid shifts. All of a sudden, they're taking a lot more risks. I always think about this with when I first started working in trauma, and in shock trauma. I would work with people all day long, and families that when their loved one got in a car accident, they were speeding, they were on a motorcycle, all these different situations. And I would get in my car to drive home and go 115 miles an hour and think, oh, wow. Like I just worked with people all day who were in motor vehicle accidents and died. There was this disconnect, some challenge in sort of coping with that, which came out in very self-destructive behavior. Obviously, we think about alcohol and drugs as well, to sort of numb the pain of grief. Again, Worden would say that in that idea of the task of dealing, or sort of working through the pain of the loss, is this could be a hiccup and a complication when people sort of try to avoid through drug and alcohol stuff as well. It doesn't have to be drug and alcohol for sure. Unaccountable sadness, again, that's normative in the normal grief process, but there are times when that becomes so intense that the person can no longer function. Phobias, kind of already talked about that with physical symptoms, but sometimes folks will start showing up with some symptoms of kind of like hypochondriac, like they're so worried about their stomach, they think they're dying. Maybe they won't get in the car, or they won't get on a plane. We start seeing these phobias start showing up that many times are very much themed around the type of loss that they've experienced. And then also one of the, I think, probably most telltale signs of some complicated grief is avoiding reminders of the deceased. So anything that reminds them, they take pictures down, they get rid of things, anything that reminds them of the deceased, they sort of get rid of. On the flip side of that, right, this is sort of like the polar extremes here, but you can have people who hold on to everything, which also could be some sort of abnormal grief response where they can't let go of anything, they have to hold on to it. Oftentimes we see over time that resolves, but it's possible that you can see either extreme of that. Okay, so I'm going to skip over here I'll go back here. So risk factors, we've already kind of talked about these are the mediators of mourning, so I'm going to skip over those. Anticipatory grief, right? This is where grieving occurs prior to the actual loss, right? And folks start working through the grieving process before the person dies. Okay, so I'm going to post this PowerPoint so that you can look at this. There's some information about some research studies. This is particularly interesting because these are the psychological effects when we're talking about chronic grief and more so even the anticipatory grief where people are caregivers for an extended period of time. We see that there are some very challenging psychological effects on caregivers where they lose their social contacts. They oftentimes feel like they've lost their role in their life, and everything really becomes about caring for their loved one. And we see this one study, I know these are a little bit old, this Hubble and Hubble study, looked at gender differences in caregiving and found that that males oftentimes, because they had a very rigid role prior to the illness, had a really hard time with their grief responses and their caregiving anticipatory grief because their role was so dramatically changed. And again, I think that as society is changing, we may see that changes as well. But folks who have very rigid roles, oftentimes when in caregiving, have to change and transition into a caregiving role, will have a very hard time with anticipatory grief in the process. Okay, so there's lots of great resources here for you to look at as well. So I'm going to post a discussion thread for you to post something quickly on that. And again, this week was sort of just wrapping up Warden and talking a little bit about complicated grief, which is also in your Warden reading. So I would encourage you to do that. Next week, we're going to start talking about special populations, talking about gender, and also start talking about kids. All right, if you have any questions, concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me. Take care. Bye-bye.